Good afternoon from Abu Dhabi. I am the Red Dragon, and we're going to talk about a very unique subject. And again, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning around the world from Abu Dhabi. Just a data classification today. What I'm going to be talking about is traffic light protocol red. Please don't share it outside of this conference, although this is global, so let's observe Chatham House rules. Thus, no attribution to me as we go through this. What I would like to remind everyone is certainly to thank the members of the Abu Dhabi Cybersecurity Council, the Dubai Electronic Security Center, and Hack in the Box for putting on this Cyber Week. Thank you all very much for bringing me over to talk about this very complex subject. So, shukran. So let's talk about chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons first, and then we'll talk about really, as it relates to the Gulf Cooperation Council, the combined effect of both cyber and bioweapons affecting future conflict. I will put my contact information up at the end of this slide, and I encourage people to reach out if they have questions about the material. I have made the slides available already to the organizer, so those should be available through download or however they get those out to you. So let's talk about where we are in the earth right now. We're within the Gulf Cooperation Council, a region that I grew up in. I actually grew up in the Islamic Republic of Iran before the Shah was deposed. So you can imagine that I have a fondness for this region of the world. I've worked here in many capacities, and certainly I have a fondness for the region. Here's a geographical outlay of the area of operations that we're going to talk about today, specifically focused on the countries not only within the GCC, but also around the countries that perhaps may have a desire to destabilize the region. So let's talk about it. Really, the cyber landscape within the GCC is one of a very difficult and increasingly attack surface. There's no one dominant cyber actor. Everybody has their motivations, their capabilities, and of course there are different targets of opportunity or aggression based on motivations. One that comes to mind most recently was last week when the Moses group essentially went after Israel. What's interesting about this is they went after with ransomless malware, which means they were not looking to extract and extort, but rather destroy through basically the discussion of information that they gathered. Now, they didn't use any sort of combined arms necessarily, but it's interesting because what they did do is, without attribution, of course, for the Israelis, is they focused specifically on critical infrastructure, areas including power grid, maybe some maps, certainly the traffic, and all of the infrastructure that makes the country of Israel run. What is dangerous about this is there was no one really given direct attribution. Speaking to some of my colleagues here that are from Israel, of course, they will give you a laugh and a wink and say, we know who it was. But I don't think there's any solid attribution about that. Of course, within the GCC, as you can see on this map, this shows where this conference is coming from. My second home, the Middle East. Now, as we talk about the Moses group, it's interesting. With that ransomless malware, they were able to essentially extract a variety of types of information. As I mentioned, maps, but more importantly, they were able to extract the personnel records of the Israeli Defense Force. Now, this in and of itself may be benign, but I can tell you what, having served in the U.S. Marine Corps, if my information were out on the web from a nefarious threat actor, I'd be a little bit concerned. So let's continue to talk about this. This gives you a graphic representation of some of the critical infrastructure and certainly the graphic of the Israeli Defense Force. Now, it is no surprise, perhaps, that I put up the IRGC, the Islamic Republic Guard Corps, perhaps as a reference to those that would want to do harm to Israel with the ransomless attacks. Now, our agenda today is, of course, we're going to talk about the chemical and bioweapons within the GCC. We'll talk about history, terms, the development of those, and then most importantly, I'm going to talk to you about cyber warfare and the combined use of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons from the various nation states that surround the GCC. But I do also want to mention that in the Islamic Republic of Iran, roughly 3 weeks ago, their critical infrastructure was attacked. Some would say perhaps that the Moses hacks were in retribution or rendition acts for what had been taking place in their country not too long ago, because the Iranians felt the wrath of having gasoline not being able to dispense. Imagine critical infrastructure where you cannot get around and conduct your daily duties. This is perhaps the nightmare of any nation, and certainly for Iran it was destabilizing for a while. Now, as we've entered the Arab world, again, I want to reemphasize that we are in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, the GCC in and of itself has made its presence known on a very peaceful, cooperative, achieving coordination with member states, really establishing sectors of technological, engineering, and administrative affairs, thus the Hack in the Box event sponsored here by the government. They also wanted to promote scientific and technical exchange through progress, really encouraging the private sector to come forward and help stabilize the infrastructure of the GCC members. And of course, that includes the military. And what you can understand here is that you have 6 countries, as noted up here. I won't read them to you other than to say they make up a majority of the geographic area of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, they wanted to focus on cooperating with each other, including those military activities. What this means in terms of, I should have told you, is the bottom line up front, is that you have 6 armies that are working together with the latest military technology to defend themselves with a rather significant annual investment. Now, of course, that military readiness includes ensuring that they are protected from a variety of threat actors, from the lowest form of kinetic types of attacks, such as improvised explosive devices, to perhaps even an errant missile strike. But really, it's important to understand that with all of these tasks and capabilities, the GCC, from a military perspective, want to protect its history and, of course, the monarchy that is established within that. But let's talk about some of the more interesting biological and chemical aspects of the presentation today, namely chemical weapons within the GCC. History is important because in the 1980s in Iran, it's interesting because during that Iraq-Iran war, then the former regime holder of Iraq used nerve gas, including sarin and mustard gas, to kill opposing soldiers of the Iranian army. It's interesting because according to released unclassified CIA documents, that perhaps even the United States may have been complicit in providing these types of chemical weapons to the then leader of Iraq. And then in the middle of the 80s in Halabja, you have the regime basically unleashing mustard gas against Kurdish rebels. Unfortunately, within that example, there were significant civilian casualties, which is quite unfortunate, as you can see here. Now, not necessarily within the GCC, but Tbilisi, Georgia is another example of chemical weapons used by a military really against protesters. And certainly this is no news to anyone, but that is certainly something when you talk about oleoresin capsium, or OC spray, used from a law enforcement perspective. And then most notably in 2018 in Syria, we have the Assad regime using chemical weapons against civilian targets with a devastating catastrophic effect. We'll get to that here in a little bit. What I would like to do, though, is introduce you to the military leaders of the GCC. They have come together from a cooperative perspective to protect the various monarchies that they represent. This is important because it lends itself to the chain of command in terms of military conflict, of which we're talking about this afternoon. Now, part and parcel of that, of course, is really chemical and biological weapons. And it's important to understand from a military perspective the history associated with this. Because if you have served in the military, you've had training with regard to nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. As distasteful as that is, that's what the modern battlefield represents as a threat surface to those of us that have served. Part and parcel of that, of course, is World War I. The U.S. Army had created Edgewood, which essentially weaponized a variety of different types of gas, including chlorine and mustard. And they deployed this with devastating effects during the trench warfare in Europe during World War I. A German scientist, Fritz Haber, actually pioneered the use and rise of chemical weapons, basically saying in future wars the military will not be able to ignore these poison gases. It is essentially a higher form of killing. Perhaps that was a foreshadowing of what would happen during World War II with the Jewish population. And then, of course, chemical warfare during World War I, of course, included tear gases that I mentioned, oleoresin capsium, chlorine-based, phosgene, and of course diophosgene, and of course mustard gas. All of these can have catastrophic, devastating effects on the military population that is fighting in a trench warfare. You can imagine that gas will sink to the lowest level within those trenches where the occupants are hiding from the incoming kinetic ammunition, the bombs. And of course, there are chemical warfare nerve agents as well, such as tabin, sarin, which we've heard historically used in Asia, soman, and cyclosarin. These are all devastating nerve agents that, if unleashed in a combined arms with military actions, could yield a very catastrophic effect on a civilian population. I would not want to be there if this happened. Now, poisons such as sarin, VX, mustard gas, and hydrocyanuric acid are really, these are the weapons grade, the military grade chemical weapons specifically toxic agents within the military that could be used within the GCC. Now, of course, those development terms that I would like you to be aware of include everything from biological warfare through the strategic information warfare research capabilities and the use of missiles, including dual chemical weapons with kinetic devices. And then, of course, at the bottom rung, of course, are those irritating riot weapons, that OC gas that I keep mentioning. Now, weaponized military biologics and chemicals include a variety of things from bacterial biological agents, as you see on the screen, to viral biological agents such as rickettsidia, chlamydia, and of course toxin-like warfare. All of these can yield such things as fungal biological warfare agents, which, if unleashed on a military action, could render the opposing enemy basically ineffective from a combat perspective. Now, the types of weapons that I'd like to also mention, of course, include drug-resistant microorganisms, perhaps even the injection of animals, such as, in this case, in this region, camels, as animal soldiers. And then, of course, you have ethnic bombs, anthrax, and even biological viruses. These are the types of readiness for defense that the GCC militaries must prepare themselves for. And, of course, the typical warfighting uses include area denial of adversaries, essentially spreading or spraying VX through rockets over an area. And you can see from this chart, based on the delivery method, that you can essentially focus on an area for the delivery of this, or you could essentially focus on a denial of service for a particular military. Pardon me, it's a little warm here, and I'm from a cold region of the world, Minnesota. All right. So, when it comes to warfare being used by militaries, it's important to understand that some of these delivery methods of weaponization include, as I mentioned, a wide area by bomb or missile. Imagine spraying this poison over a city, such as somewhere in Syria, or from a helicopter or another type of aircraft. Imagine in the streets of any city within the GCC a truck racing through the streets spreading this type of gas. The enemy, in this case, may be someone that is simply driving a delivery truck that weaponizes that delivery method. The victims, unfortunately, would be civilians because these would be the populated areas that they would be targeting. And of course, I mentioned the use of chlorine gas in Eastern Ghouta during 2018 by the Assad regime in Syria. Unfortunately, a child was killed and, of course, 11 other civilians. But it's important to note that the Assad regime had no compunction about delivering this type of warfare method. As diabolical as it was, they did it with no compunction for civilians. That is not what militaries do. We do not target civilian populations. Absolutely not. Types of nuclear, biological, and weapons types, of course, as I mentioned, include some of those hazardous substances. They're intended to cause severe injury. Those chemicals and poisons really destabilize the biochemical makeup of a human being. And if you're used on untrained civilians, they can be very fatal, dangerous, and can be destabilizing in and of themselves, not including the cyber, which we'll talk about here shortly. A variety of different agents that I've talked about already include those that you see here, but it's important that the classification of these biological weapons are being discovered not only by GCC countries in terms of preparation for defensive measures, but also offensively against some of the countries within the region that are not part of the GCC. Now, there are top 10 deadly toxic agents within these chemical weapons. You can see on this eye chart that you see up here. What really is important to understand that each one of these has the capability to be delivered through a military rocket system or perhaps even a ground mortar system. It's very important to understand that from a kinetic perspective, all you are doing is changing the composition of the military round from explosive device to nuclear, biological, or chemical, depending on the targeting that you're using. Now, those weapons capabilities are very interesting, and this is where it gets very, very curious. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the nation states that are not part of the GCC. We'll talk about their nuclear, biological, and chemical development of weapon systems in conjunction with the likely courses of action when using cyber warfare, informatization, if you will, from a Chinese perspective. Now, in Algeria, of course, they have developed chemical weapons. They're in the early stages, I would say, from an unclassified perspective. They are certainly looking at biological weapons as well as nuclear weapons. This will equate rather interestingly to correspond to their cyber capabilities. It's a nascent, developing capability that they are not willing to publicize, although you should be aware that this is indeed happening. Egypt, on the other hand, they've had certainly the direct use of oleoresin capsaicin against civilian protesters during the Arab Spring, and they have considered using other types of biological weapons. It is important to understand that from a military perspective, they're very aware that if they use those weapons too grandiosely or grandly against the civilian population, that you can imagine that that could have a destabilizing effect on the civilian population. The money slide for these two countries is their likely courses of cyber warfare action for Algeria and Egypt. Algeria, of course, they have the opportunity to learn from their neighbor nations, not only from the nuclear, biological, and chemical capability, but also from a cyber capability. Many conferences that I've attended over the past decade or so, I've met a variety of hackers, and that is exactly where they learn from each other. They don't do it from a malicious perspective. That's what the military is used for. So needless to say, they're developing that cyber muscle memory. And I believe that their third course of action is that they will begin to develop cyber activities, including offensive and defensive cyber warfare capabilities, not only against neighbors for fear of destabilizing themselves, but also against their civilian population. Egypt is another story. They have exported offensive hackers to support military capabilities of nations throughout the GCC. This should be no surprise to anyone. They do indeed have an organic civilian hacking capability. What's really unique about this is while they are primarily offensive in their nature, they will replace the defensive measures to support and continue regime continuity, basically maintaining the chain of command within Egypt. That third course of action, of course, is to realize foreign support from both the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation to supplement developing and really organically creating an offensive and defensive military hacking capability that surpasses their neighbors. Of course, Israel, no stranger to chemical weapons. I apologize for the insensitivity of this graphic, but it details their arch enemy during World War II. Remember I mentioned Professor Haber as a foreshadowing? The Israelis will make sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they are not subject to that same sort of chemical treatment of their civilian population. They learned the hard way. And certainly those biological weapons, it's interesting, they have not signed the Bioweapons Convention, the BWC. And while they have conducted extensive research into these capabilities, and they have a dedicated research facility regarding biological research, they are intent on ensuring that they have a defensive capability. But make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, they will use it if they feel threatened. And then from a nuclear weapons perspective, certainly they don't want any one of their neighbors, perhaps specifically the Islamic Republic of Iran, to develop weapons that could harm them. So from a defensive perspective, they need to be prepared in order to repel those types of activities and threats from countries that would want to develop nuclear weapons to destroy them. It is very much a rocky road, no pun intended. Now, the likely cyber warfare courses of action for the Israeli nation, of course, the number one COA, in response to aggression from neighbors, most likely to operationalize the use of combined arms in a traditional sense, such as kinetic attacks, the standard military, and focus on direct military action on high-value targets of opportunity. Think about a low-level attack such as destabilizing the critical infrastructure of Iran, and if they got angry enough, perhaps they would use chemical weapons to destabilize a region of that particular country for their offensive aims. Again, that's statecraft at its finest. Their second COA, of course, is preemptive physical attacks on adversary nation states. Think of Stuxnet and the Operation Olympic Games. Prevent further development of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. If you can have that first mover advantage from a military perspective, you own the battlefield, you will be victorious. This would be the mantra of the Israeli Defense Forces. The third course of action, of course, would be that combined use of military operations by cyber preparation of the battlefield specifically, creating further soft targets for destruction, and degrading the critical infrastructure, making it unusable through both kinetic means as well as potentially chemical weapons to essentially render the adversary useless, destabilize, demoralize the civilian population. If you do that, ladies and gentlemen, successfully, you have achieved your operation of using combined arms from a cyber and a nuclear, biological, chemical perspective. And of course, Libya, bottom line up front here is, of course, from a U.S. unclassified perspective, is that they essentially are more than likely successful in judging how they could adopt this type of delivery mentioned. It's interesting to note that in '82, they did ratify the BWC, and in 2004, they actually declared metric tons of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons for destruction by the OPCW. Of course, Libya has had a history of developing chemical and biological weapons for its purposes. It's interesting to note that under the Omar Gaddafi regime, this certainly would have been one of those major military initiatives from his perspective. Again, forgive me for wiping my brow. It is a little warm here under these lights. The likely courses of action for Libya include the following. They will continue to use propaganda and disinformation against the government of national accord, supported by militias from across western Libya, and of course, they will go do so in support of the Khalifa Haftar's Libyan armed forces, the LAAF. Combined with the foreign hackers that they will seek to employ, they're going to shape public opinion to their advantage through this information campaign. So they're not going to necessarily attack the critical infrastructure unless it becomes necessary for them to deny the use of infrastructure by civilians. Course of action number 2 is, of course, the increased use of Chinese-made drones and surveillance capabilities. Also conducting long-range strikes on arms depots and facilities such as airports. It's really important because they will use this for close air support for units of the military embeshed in military operations on urban terrain, MOUT. And then that third action is they're going to attempt to move beyond entry-level cyber operations and focus on more network-based types of offensive and defensive attacks. If they are successful at this, I predict that they will use that in conjunction with a chemical store in order to deny areas of rebels so that they can fix them in place and destroy them with these Chinese drones. And then, of course, Syria. I've already mentioned them, but needless to say, they certainly have the capability from a very distinct perspective of developing bioweapons programs. It's interesting to note that they have a significant capability not only for ground-based attacks, but certainly from air delivery mechanisms. And that is what has happened throughout Syria historically. What's interesting, in 2020, they were responsible for a total of 3 chemical attacks targeting the civilian population. And then, of course, that happened again in 3 days in 2017. What's interesting is that this was delivered by a Russian military aircraft, the Su-22. And it's interesting that the Syrian Air Force was responsible for delivering these weaponized chemical agents. It's unfortunate because the dense civilian population was the one that realized this kinetic attack from both a chemical perspective as well as the incendiary devices that were dropped on them. Now, what's really very disturbing is that they, being the Syrian regime, possess between 600 and 1,000 metric tons of nerve gas. So they are not afraid or unwilling to unleash this kind of combined arms capability. They have done so historically and have demonstrated that their success in this area is something that they believe will control the rebels who seek to destabilize this Assad regime. And of course, part of this is the Damascus area of influence, which realized a mass casualty event. I don't mean to put up the child in jeopardy there, but it underscores the necessity for understanding the military resolve of a regime that will use chemical weapons on its own population. Imagine if they were essentially promoting the idea of moving to a particular area of a town or a city through disinformation campaigns and then struck them with both kinetic weapons, bombs, as well as chemical weapons. You can imagine that it would have a devastating effect not only on the civilian population, but certainly on the military fighters attempting to destabilize the regime. Some of the chemical attacks, as you can see from this map, are numerous. To go through each one of these would take 8 hours, but I do want you to understand that they used a variety of things from phosphorus munitions, sarin gas, chlorine types of gas, mustard gas, and other unknown agents, more than likely VX gas on the populations. Certainly you've seen reports on this on the international news. It is really disturbing to see that this type of activity is taking place from a regime, a nation state, against the civilian population. What is more unique about this is the activity or the capability that Syria is developing is rather unique. It's unique in the region because they don't necessarily have a reason to have this much chemical, biological weapons capability. They already have the support of the Russians, Certainly they can deliver militarily from a kinetic perspective these types of weapon systems. When they start to combine this with cyber operations, which are enabled from an offensive and defensive capability, you might imagine that the courses of action will look like this. Number one, they will continue to operationalize civilian hacking cadre as a direct fire weapon against targets of civilian opportunity, even going so far as to attempt to destabilize and destroy cyber targets overseas. Any one of those that oppose the Assad regime and the vulnerable civilian infrastructure will be the targets. If you are a country within the GCC that is not an ally of perhaps the Syrians, and you speak about this openly, you can imagine that you will start to reap some of the cyber-enabled activities. If you're in closer proximity, however, then course of action number 2 comes into play. Syria will start to rely more and more on military electronic warfare capabilities from the Russian Federation, including electronic warfare and jamming types of systems from the Kronushka platform, which will enable the ground forces to target rebel communications both domestically in a place and time of their choosing so they can destroy them with kinetic weapons. That's a true form of kinetic and cyber. What's interesting is when they start to lace that together with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, you can imagine that the devastating effect on those rebel forces will be untenable. Certainly the civilian population has faced the wrath of this type of activity. And then course of action number 3, as the continued global international pressure on the Assad regime starts to put its pressure on them, the Assad regime will start to turn to attacking destructively opposing nations, as I just mentioned. And attacks on infrastructure and the civilian populations nearest to them will be their targets of opportunity. It is unfortunately something that is quite serious in this part of the world. And then the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course, bottom line up front, they have developed active chemical weapons programs. And during the Iran-Iraq War, facing the scrutiny of Saddam Hussein, for example, they felt the effects of both sarin and mustard gas during their own version of a Middle Eastern trench warfare. It's estimated that in excess of 20,000 Iranian soldiers paid them the price for this during this 8-year conflict. This is just unbelievable. If you've ever fought in battle or been on a battlefield, it's hard enough without having to think about the impact and effect of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. I can't begin to even describe how horrifying that might possibly be. And then, of course, the Iranians have a very developed cyber capability. I've spoken about this at conferences around the world. Needless to say, I will tell you that they have a developing and burgeoning hacking community that, if used by the Islamic Guard Corps, Republican Guard Corps, the IGRC, it will have a devastating effect. Combine that with their experiences learned during the Iraq-Iran War, you can imagine that that could have a very destabilizing effect against enemies of the Islamic Republic of Iran state. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, they will turn and unleash that fury if they feel that they are threatened. You must remember historically that they are, and still believe that they are, the grandest nation within the Middle East. In my history and experience, they used to run the world before perhaps even the Chinese did. So they want to maintain and reestablish that leadership, and they have started to do that through their hacking capability. The 3 most likely cyber warfare courses of action, of course, include that they will operationalize their civilian hacking cadre as a direct fire weapon against targets of opportunity internationally, starting regionally, of course, as we began this presentation giving the Moses Group hacking Israel. Not saying that the Iranians did it, but that's the most likely adversary in this particular case. The current regime is very much looking for vulnerable civilian infrastructures within the GCC and globally. Certainly my country, the United States of America, has faced not only threats to healthcare, thus my involvement in the biohacking village at DEF CON, but also against financial institutions. A number of my colleagues at some of the largest banks in the United States have felt the wrath of the Iranian hackers already. Course of action number 2 is their nationalistic sense of pride that I just talked about will indeed manifest itself against known historical allies in the region. And it will include a form of enduring hacking campaigns directed against specific critical infrastructures. I just mentioned the experience from hacking by Iran in my country. You can expect that that will happen here in this region. What remains to be seen, however, is that if the Iranians hack healthcare, banking, and nuclear energy development, as a response to their country being taken down, they will most certainly use a chemical or a biological weapon to destabilize the civilian population with the end game of achieving victory at all costs. Course of action number 3, and I say this with respect, they will remain the poster child country of malware weaponization and infections throughout the GCC. Certainly with the beginning of Stuxnet in 2007, traditional governance and other types of initiatives of the nation states will continue to fail, which will cause unending embarrassment and unfulfilled rage by the leadership of Iran. If they cannot realize that reestablishment as the basic powerful nation that they once were, they will start to act out as a petulant child. It's a very curious developing situation. And of course, you can see from this graphic that the develop of nuclear weapons capabilities remains something that they are indeed focused on, not only from a nation-state leadership perspective, but also from a military perspective. The two work hand in hand in order to ensure that nations around them realize that there is the capability that is being developed to unleash nuclear weapons in conjunction with cyber warfare. And of course, the weaponization of malware, as you can see on this chart, is very curious, and it's a little bit disturbing because the impact and effect is direct against the GCC nations. And of course, my country, the U.S. You'll notice from Stuxnet in 2007 through Dooku, Flame, Gauss, and Batchwiper, for example, while it started out from a military denial of area operations with Stuxnet, it has started to move from original purpose of cyber physical destruction to cyber espionage, cyber reconnaissance. Targets of opportunity, of course, have included industrial control systems, computer systems. You can imagine the headlines are full of these. Banks here in the Middle East, and of course, Iranian oil infrastructure. Whoops. That was unfortunate. Hit the wrong button during a live presentation and all heck. Bear with me, I'm going to recover. Almost to the end, forgive me here. There we go. Whoops. Yeah, don't try this at home, ladies and gentlemen. Got to be cool under pressure. I was talking about weaponized malware. It's very important to understand that indeed this has happened and has exploded outside of the GCC region. Again, forgive me for that misstep. Fat fingers on a keyboard, no good during a live presentation. And of course, the nuclear destabilization of Iran is something that they, being the Islamic Republic, do not want to have happen. What's unique about Iran's soft war is that their probability of a cyber attack impacting the physical world has increased rapidly. Certainly, my mention of the Moses hacks last week against the Israeli Defense Force and the critical infrastructure of Israel bears true that this fact is absolutely true about Iran's soft war. They believe, for example, that cyber warfare and the weapons such as malware, and I mentioned ransomless malware at the beginning of this, will indeed deliver software written and designed by hackers, which are really relatively inexpensive. Anyone with a keyboard and a mouse sitting anywhere within Iran can unleash that type of attack against a country of their choosing. And of course, their ability to conduct cyber attacks on America's electric power systems certainly goes without any sort of mention of compunction here. And then, of course, from Iran's perspective, it's very important to understand what they're developing when it comes to defeating other countries in the region. And then I put this up to help you understand from an Asian perspective, specifically the People's Republic of China. They too have had their issues with cyber weapons. How does this tie to the GCC? I would suggest that you use it as an exemplar. Look at the way that the Japanese and the Chinese forces fought each other during World War II, and you'll see that chemical weapons were used without abandon against civilian populations. I would beg you to not let that happen within the GCC. And of course, within Iran, the inventories are down, but that risk remains quite the same. Those weapons of mass destruction, WMDs as they're called, have decreased, but the size of those stockpiles for readily deployable military weaponization of the same still remain quite a serious concern for you within the GCC, specifically biological weapons. And then, of course, cyber warfare without a solution is nothing at all, as you might imagine. And then, of course, my conclusions for you regarding the combined arms use of cyber weapons and biochemical weapons includes the following conclusions. Militant Gulf region countries pose the greatest threat to your countries here in the GCC. The use of bioweapons militarily against civilian populations, while a fact, but my request to know is that how long before this becomes a regional impact as nations become frustrated. And destabilization is something they want to promote as a statecraft initiative. Terrorist activities are going to occur with emphasis on bioweapons. This has occurred throughout the world. You can imagine that terrorist activities using biochemical and nuclear weapons will happen in the GCC. I hope that's not the case. And of course, I've been accused of predicting things that happen, and I hope that doesn't happen here. The military use of bioweapons is, in fact, something that has occurred in the Gulf region, during wartime specifically, during a conflict. If the region remains peaceful, the likelihood of this actually occurring remains low. GCC nation neighbors are more interested and focused on the use of military bioweapons. That doesn't mean they're going to deploy them. It just means that they need to prepare for success should they be unleashed. Number 6, there is a distinct correlation between nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons within militant regional nation states. Think Algeria, think Libya, think Iran, and certainly other countries that would have a desire and a reason to deploy those types of weapon systems. With the departure of my country, the United States, from the GCC region, unfortunately, the increased use of bioweapons is probably going to take place. Terrorist activity will run unabated because they now see that there is no threat from the West to destabilize a terrorist network. Economic development by the People's Republic of China is going to increase, and the adaptation of these Chinese manufactured red bioweapons capabilities will increase for some of these nation states that pose a threat to the GCC. Cooperation, communication, and collaboration is necessary from a cyber information, a military cyber operations perspective to defeat, degrade, and destroy the asymmetric bioweapons threats posed to all GCC nations. To sum it up, you've got a long road ahead of you, but it can be accomplished. That concludes my presentation today. Again, this is how you get a hold of me. I will be here at Hack in the Box in Abu Dhabi. Again, thank you to the sponsors for the event and bringing me over. Thank you to the United Arab Emirates and the monarchy for allowing me to speak on this sensitive subject. Thank you very much, and have a great day.